The smoking cowboy who stole a young man's heart, and then. Cowboy Love Secrets, a story that will stay with you. The first time I saw Cole Hargrove, he was leaning against my father's barn at 2 in the morning, smoke curling from between his lips like a whispered secret, and he was crying. Not loudly, not the way you cry when you want someone to notice. It was the other kind, the quiet, careful kind, where your jaw is tight and your eyes are wet, and you're staring at something in the dark that no one else can see. His hat was tipped back on his head, and the silver moonlight caught the line of his jaw and the slope of his shoulders, and I stood there in the doorway of our farmhouse in my socks and an old t-shirt, holding a glass of water I no longer remembered why I'd gotten up for, and I thought, who is this man, and what broke him tonight? I didn't say anything. I should have gone back inside, but I didn't. I stood there for a long moment, watching the smoke rise, watching him breathe, watching the way he pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose like he was trying to hold something inside himself. And then he turned his head, just slightly, and he saw me standing there. He didn't startle. He didn't look embarrassed. He just looked at me with those dark, unhurried eyes and said, low and rough, "You gonna stand there all night, or are you gonna come out here and pretend you didn't see that?" And I said, without thinking, "I don't think I can pretend." He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite anything, and he took another slow drag of his cigarette and looked back up at the sky. "Fair enough," he said. And that was it. That was the beginning of everything. My name is Elias Carter. Most people call me Eli. I grew up on a cattle ranch in the hill country of central Texas, about 40 miles west of a town called Fredericksburg, where the roads go red with dust in the summer, and the sky at night is so full of stars it almost feels cruel, like the universe is showing off. My father, Robert Carter, raised cattle and quarter horses and 3 children, and he ran his operation with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. No wasted movement, no wasted words. I was the middle child and the one who'd always been hardest to read, or at least that's what my older sister Claire told me. She'd say it without meanness, sitting on the porch swing with a sweet tea, looking at me sideways. "You carry everything inside, Eli. You always have. It'll eat you alive one day if you let it." I usually just shrugged. I didn't know how to argue with her because she wasn't wrong. I was 22 that summer. I'd finished 2 years of college studying agricultural management, and I'd come back to the ranch full-time after my father's knee surgery slowed him down. It wasn't a sacrifice, not exactly. I'd always known I'd come back to this land. The smell of it, the way the cedar and the dry grass and the heat combined into something that just smelled like home. There was no running from that, not for me. What I hadn't expected was Cole. My father hired him in early June, about a week after I got back. Cole Hargrove was 23 years old, born somewhere in West Texas, Odessa or thereabouts, though he didn't offer that information freely. He'd worked several ranches before ours, had good references and could shoe a horse, fix fencing, handle cattle and repair just about anything mechanical with enough wire and enough patience. He was exactly what my father needed. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a truck that was older than both of us, dark blue, one side mirror held on with electrical tape. He climbed out wearing worn boots and jeans and a long-sleeved shirt rolled to the elbows, and he shook my father's hand and said, "Mr. Carter, I appreciate the work. I'll earn it." My father, who was not a man of unnecessary compliments, nodded and said, "I believe you will." I was standing near the fence with a post driver, watching all this from a distance. I told myself I wasn't watching him specifically. I told myself I was just taking a break. But I noticed things. The way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, like a man who'd learned long ago not to rush because rushing leads to mistakes and mistakes on a ranch can cost you. The way he took off his hat when he spoke to my father, a small gesture of respect that most men his age didn't bother with anymore. The way, when he turned and looked across the property and his eyes passed over me briefly, he gave a single slow nod, like we'd already reached some kind of agreement. I nodded back. I picked up my post driver and went back to work. I didn't think about him again until dinner, when my mother set an extra plate at the table, and Cole sat across from me and ate quietly and answered questions with short, complete answers, and asked for seconds of the cornbread without hesitation, and my mother looked pleased. "You're welcome here, Cole," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," he said. "It's the best meal I've had in a while." He said it simply, not flattery, just the truth stated plainly. And my mother, who could spot insincerity from 3 counties away, smiled for real. I watched all of this. I told myself I was just curious about the new guy. I'd been away at college for 2 years, and I wasn't used to having someone new around the property. That was all it was. Sure it was. The ranch hands had a bunkhouse about 100 yards from the main house, not fancy, but solid, 4 bunks and a wood stove and a bathroom, and a small table where the men played cards on Saturday nights. Cole was assigned the far bunk, near the window. Our 2 other long-term hands, Marcus and Billy, had worked the ranch for years and accepted Cole with the easy companionship of men who understand that the work is what matters, not the small talk. I spent my days working alongside my father and the hands, and within the first week it became clear that Cole was exceptionally good at this. Not in a showy way, not the way some men are always looking to prove something. He was good the way a tool is good when it fits perfectly in your hand, no wasted energy, no friction. He read the cattle well, anticipated my father's needs before they were voiced, and could fix things that by all rights should have been unfixable. He was also almost completely private. At breakfast, he was quiet. At lunch, he ate and went back to work. At dinner, he answered questions but rarely initiated conversation. He didn't talk about where he'd come from, what he'd done before, why he'd moved around so much. Marcus and Billy, who'd both grown up in small towns and understood that a man's story was his own to tell, didn't push. My mother, who had the gentle instinct of someone who understood loneliness when she saw it, just kept feeding him well and treating him with warmth, and didn't ask for anything in return. My father watched him work and said nothing except once to me, "Good hands on that one." Coming from my father, that was a soliloquy. But me, I was neither as patient as Marcus and Billy nor as instinctively kind as my mother. I was 22 and curious, and if I'm being honest, drawn to him in a way that I didn't fully understand and wasn't ready to examine. I found excuses to work near him. I offered help he didn't need. I asked questions about fencing techniques and water pump repairs that I already knew the answers to, just to hear him respond. He always answered, brief, informative, occasionally dry. Once, when I asked about a particular knot he was using on a fence repair, he showed me slowly, his hands moving with that same deliberate patience, and then he looked up at me and said, "You already knew that knot. You used it on the east fence 2 days ago." I felt heat rise to my face. I said, "Maybe I wanted to see if your version was different." He held my gaze for a moment. Something in his eyes shifted, not quite amusement, not quite warmth, something between the two. "It's not," he said. And he went back to work, and I went back to pretending I was fine. The night I found him crying by the barn was our 7th day as something adjacent to coworkers. That morning, he'd received a phone call in the yard, his cell phone. The screen cracked across one corner, and the way he'd walked away to take it, head down, one hand shoved in his back pocket, told me without words that it wasn't a good call. He was quieter than usual at lunch. He got through dinner fine, said good night to my mother, and headed to the bunkhouse. I'd gone to bed early, couldn't sleep, got up for water, and there he was. After he said fair enough and went back to looking at the sky, I made a decision. I walked across the yard in my socks, the dry grass prickling under my feet, and I sat down on the wooden bench near the barn door, close enough to be present but not so close as to intrude. I didn't say anything, I just sat there. He smoked, I watched the stars. After a while, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer, it was hard to tell because the night had that quality of stillness where time moves differently, he said. "You don't have to stay." "I know," I said. Another pause. The smoke rose and dissipated. "Bad news," he said, not explaining, just acknowledging. "You don't have to tell me," I said. He glanced over at me. There was something in the way he did it, like he was checking whether I meant it, testing if my patience was genuine or performative. I tried to make sure my face said I mean it. I'm good at a lot of things. Being readable isn't usually one of them, but apparently that night something came through. He took a long, slow breath. "My dad," he said, "he's not doing great." "I'm sorry," I said. I didn't ask more. I just let it sit there in the air between us. He was quiet for a moment and then, "We're not close, haven't been in years," but he paused, pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose again. "It's still your dad, you know." "Yeah," I said, "I know." He finished his cigarette and tamped it out on the sole of his boot and pocketed the end, which I noticed. He wasn't the kind of man who littered. He leaned back against the barn wall with his head tilted up at the stars, and I looked up too, and we sat there in the warm night air for a long while, not talking, just existing in the same space. Eventually, I said quietly, "The sky out here is something else, isn't it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, softer than I'd heard him speak before, "It's the best thing about Texas." Something about those words, "the best thing about Texas," said in that quiet, tired voice, with the stars blazing overhead and the crickets going and the whole sleeping ranch around us. Something about that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water, and I thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. "Get some sleep," I said, standing up. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Early morning tomorrow. Dad wants to move the south herd." He nodded without looking at me. "Thanks," he said, "for staying." I went back inside. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding my glass of water, heart doing something it had no particular reason to be doing. I told myself it was just compassion, human connection. That was all. I told myself that for approximately 4 more weeks before I stopped being able to pretend. June moved into July the way it always does in the Texas Hill Country, slowly, stubbornly, with a heat that builds and builds until you forget what cool air feels like. The cedar goes silver and dry. The creek bed shrinks. The cattle stand in whatever shade they can find, and the horses are restless in the morning and still in the afternoon, and every man on the property develops the same squinting, half-resigned look of someone learning to coexist with something you can't fight. Cole thrived in the heat. I don't know how else to put it. While the rest of us were wiping our foreheads and drinking water every 20 minutes, he just seemed to absorb it, moving through the heavy days with that same unhurried pace, unbothered in a way that was almost unfair. He'd roll his sleeves up in the afternoons, his forearms tanned and steady, and just work. Fence line repairs, water trough maintenance, cattle rotation, horse care, whatever needed doing, he did it. My father started giving him more responsibility. First the south pasture, then the horses. Then, by mid-July, he was essentially functioning as the foreman, though we didn't call it that. He organized the daily tasks each morning with a quiet efficiency, coordinated with Marcus and Billy without friction, and checked in with my father at the end of the day with clear, honest reports. And somehow, amid all of that, he and I had started talking, real talking, not just about fence knots. It started with books, of all things. I'd left a copy of East of Eden on the porch railing one evening. I was rereading it for the 3rd time, and Cole had picked it up, glanced at the cover, and said, "You've read this before." "3 times," I said. He turned it over, read the back, handed it back. "My high school English teacher made us read it. I've thought about it almost every year since." I looked at him, seriously. "The part about Timshel," he said, "thou mayest, I think about that a lot." I stared at him for a second. He held my gaze, neither self-conscious about having said it nor pushing for a reaction. Just stated it, the way he stated everything, as simple fact. "Me too," I said. "That's exactly why I keep coming back to it." He nodded, slow and thoughtful, and went back to what he was doing. But after that, we talked about books. Not every day, not even every week, but when one of us had something to say, we said it. He'd read more than I'd expected, picking up paperbacks at gas stations and thrift stores all across Texas, reading them in the bunkhouse at night by lamplight. He'd read Cormac McCarthy and Larry McMurtry, and some Hemingway, and a few things I'd never heard of, Texas writers and West Texas poets whose names I had to look up later. He recommended a novel to me once, small press, obscure, about a man returning to his childhood home to close down his father's farm. "It's quiet," he said, handing it to me, "but it'll get to you." He was right. I finished it in 2 nights and then sat with it for a week. "You were right," I told him, returning the book. He just said, "Usually am," and his mouth did that thing, the not quite smile, more like a slight softening at one corner, and I had to look away because something about that almost smile did something to my stomach that I was not prepared to deal with. The other thing that happened in July was that I started learning his routines. Not on purpose, not like I was watching him. It was just, when you work alongside someone every day, you notice things. You can't help it. The way you know your family's patterns without thinking, the rhythm of other people's days starts to become familiar. Cole got up before anyone else, usually around 5, and made coffee in the bunkhouse before coming to the main house for breakfast. He had his cigarettes in the morning, too, out in the yard, usually near the east fence where you could see the sunrise, and then he'd stub them out and tuck them in his breast pocket, and that was it until after dinner. He wasn't a heavy smoker, more like a man who used it as punctuation, a way to frame the edges of his day. He watered the horses before he did anything else, every single morning without exception. He talked to them too, not a lot, just a word or two, a low murmur I could never quite make out, but the horses always turned toward him when he came in. My father's quarter horse, Rambler, was notoriously standoffish with strangers. He let Cole brush him inside of a week. He wrote letters, actual letters on paper in the evenings sometimes. I'd see him at the bunkhouse table through the window when I came back from checking the fence at dusk, head bent, pen moving. I never asked who he wrote to. It felt like one of those things you leave alone. He laughed rarely, but when he did it was real low and short, surprised out of him almost, like he hadn't expected it. The first time I made him actually laugh was about 3 weeks in, when I dropped an entire bucket of water on myself while trying to fill the stock tank. It wasn't a deliberate joke, but the look on his face, briefly, completely unguarded, was something I replayed for hours afterward. I know how that sounds. I'm telling this story honestly, and that means I have to tell you that I was already, by July, fairly deep in something I couldn't name out loud yet. Not to myself, not even in the quiet of my own head at night. I didn't have the vocabulary for it, or rather, I had the vocabulary, I just wasn't ready to apply it. What I knew was this: I wanted to be around him. I wanted to know what he was thinking. I wanted to make him laugh again. I wanted him to look at me the way he sometimes did, steadily, thoughtfully, like I was worth looking at, and I wanted that to mean something. And I was terrified of what it meant, that I wanted all of that. I need to say something here about growing up where I grew up. The Texas Hill Country is beautiful and stubborn and full of good people, but it is not, by nature, a place that makes it easy to be anything other than what's expected of you. My family was decent, genuinely decent. My parents weren't cruel people, and my sister Claire had friends from all kinds of lives and didn't judge any of them. But the unsaid thing about being a rancher's son, about being raised the way I was raised, in the particular culture and faith and community of that part of Texas, the unsaid thing was that certain possibilities simply weren't discussed. Not in a hostile way, just in the way that silence can be its own kind of wall. I'd been aware, for years, in a distant, theoretical way, that I was different from some of my male friends in how I experienced attraction. I'd had a girlfriend in high school, Jessie, and I'd cared for her, genuinely. But the feeling had always been warm and comfortable rather than electric, and I'd told myself that was just how I was wired, that the electricity thing was invented for movies and books. I'd kissed her on her porch the night of junior prom and felt affection and warmth, and then, driving home, a hollow sense that something important was missing. I'd buried that hollow feeling under 2 years of college and a lot of hard work and an internal deal I'd made with myself that went something like, "We don't have to figure everything out right now." And then Cole Hargrove arrived, and the hollow feeling became a specific, undeniable, quietly terrifying fullness that felt nothing like warmth and comfort and everything like electricity. So that was what I was dealing with in July, in the Texas heat, on my family's ranch, surrounded by people who loved me and had no idea. No pressure. The evening that changed things between us, not dramatically, not obviously, but changed them in the way that a small current of water changes a stone over time, happened on a Wednesday mid-July. The ranch's generator had blown a capacitor, and the main house was without power. My father was at a doctor's appointment in Fredericksburg with my mother. Claire was at work. Marcus and Billy had taken the truck into town. It was just me and Cole. We spent the afternoon fixing the generator. Or rather, Cole fixed the generator and I handed him things and asked questions, and he answered them with more patience than I probably deserved. At one point he was lying half underneath the generator housing, arm extended, working on a component I couldn't see, and he said, "Can you hold that flashlight steady?" And I knelt down close to him and held the light, and his face was inches from mine, and his eyes were focused on the mechanism. But I was not focused on the mechanism, and I almost dropped the flashlight. "You good?" he said, not looking up. "Fine," I said, "sorry." "Don't be sorry, just hold it steady." I held it steady. I stared at the generator housing and thought about absolutely nothing. By evening, the generator was running. We sat on the porch steps as the sun went down, tired and greasy, and pleased with the accomplishment in the quiet way that physical work produces when it goes well. My mother had left a covered tray of food, and we ate it on the porch without bothering with plates, passing dishes back and forth in the orange light. "You're good at fixing things," I said. He considered this. "I like understanding how things work," he said. "If you understand something, you can fix it." "What about things that can't be fixed?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not a dismissive quiet, a thinking quiet. "I'm less good at those," he admitted. And then he looked over at me, and there was something in his expression that was different from his usual opacity, something slightly more exposed, and he said, "You ask interesting questions, Eli." No one had ever said that to me before, not like that. You ask interesting questions, not good questions or smart questions. Interesting. Like I had a particular quality he'd taken note of, like he'd been paying attention. I looked at him for a second and then looked away, at the sky going red over the ridge, and I said, "You give interesting answers." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. We ate in silence for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence I'd ever sat in, and that scared me more than anything. August arrived with a thunderstorm that lasted 3 days and turned the ranch roads to rivers and kept everyone inside more than anyone liked. When you're used to wide open spaces and physical work, enforced proximity is its own kind of pressure. By the second day of rain, the bunkhouse was starting to feel small, and my father's living room, where we all gathered in the evenings, was full of that particular restless energy that comes from capable men who have nothing to do. We played cards. My father told old stories. My mother baked and made us eat. Marcus and Billy argued amiably about football, and Cole sat at the edge of all of it, not quite separate but not quite embedded either, reading, drinking coffee, occasionally looking up to add something dry and precise to a conversation, and then returning to his book. I watched him. I couldn't seem to stop. On the third evening of rain, everyone had gone to bed early except me and Cole. My parents were upstairs. Claire was at her apartment in town. Marcus and Billy had gone to the bunkhouse. The storm was still going, rain drumming on the roof and the windows, lightning occasionally lighting the whole sky white. Cole was reading. I was pretending to read. The lamp between us cast a warm circle of light over the couch and the armchair where he sat, and outside the windows the world was water and wind and darkness. He turned a page, the rain picked up, lightning stuttered through the room. I'd been working up to saying something for about 40 minutes. I'm not sure what I was working up to saying exactly, just something. Something real. Something that would move us past the careful edges we'd been maintaining. I didn't fully know what I was doing or why. I just knew that the rain and the lamplight and the silence felt like permission for honesty, the way certain nights do. "Cole," I said. He looked up from his book, present, attentive, unhurried. Can I ask you something personal? He regarded me for a moment. Probably, he said. Why do you move so much? Ranch to ranch, I mean, you've got good skills, you could settle somewhere, why don't you? The question sat between us. I watched him consider it, watched him decide something. It's easier to leave before you have to, he said finally. I turned that over. You mean before someone makes you leave? He was quiet for a beat. Sometimes. Other times before you get too attached to something you're not allowed to keep. There was something in those words, not allowed to keep, that felt larger than ranch work, larger than practicality. I wanted to pull on that thread, but I also understood instinctively that I'd already gotten more than he usually gave, and that pushing further would close a door rather than open one. I think, I said carefully, that there are things you're allowed to keep. You just have to want them badly enough to stay for them. He looked at me, not the brief, assessing glance he sometimes used. A real look, steady and long, and there was something in it I couldn't name, a kind of cautious, guarded recognition, like looking at someone through glass and wondering if they can see you looking. You believe that, he said. I'm trying to, I said. He held my gaze for another moment, then nodded slowly and returned to his book. I pretended to read for another half hour and didn't absorb a single word. The next day the rain stopped and the world came back, bright and washed and smelling like earth. And Cole and I spent the morning working side by side clearing drainage ditches and checking the fence line for storm damage, and neither of us mentioned the conversation from the night before. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, a barely perceptible alteration in pressure, a difference in the quality of the air between us. He started talking a little more. Not a lot, he wasn't a talker by nature, but the silences became less impenetrable. He'd offer things unprompted, small observations, a memory or two. One afternoon, while we were working on the horse paddock, he mentioned growing up in Odessa, his father's oil field work, the particular bleakness of a town built around extraction. He said it without self-pity, just description, the flat reportage of someone who'd processed old pain into something manageable. Did you like it, I asked, growing up there? No, he said simply, but it made me want something different. That's worth something, I guess. What did you want instead? He drove a post into the ground with 2 clean strokes, paused. Open sky, he said. Animals, work that made sense. You found it, I said. He glanced at me sideways. Parts of it, he said. I didn't ask what parts he hadn't found, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. We started spending time together in the evenings that weren't accidental or work-related. That's the truth, though neither of us ever framed it that way. It just happened. He'd finish his end-of-day check of the horses and somehow end up on the porch at the same time I was there. Or I'd be walking out to the east fence at sunset. I did that sometimes. Just to think, and he'd fall into step alongside me without explanation. We talked about small things and large things in no particular order. Music, he liked outlaw country, Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark, and was dismissive of the mainstream Nashville sound with a quiet disdain that made me laugh. I liked those things too, but also jazz and old soul, and he listened to my recommendations with genuine openness. The ranch, Texas history, which we were both unexpectedly interested in. Books, always books. One evening he asked about college, and I told him about it. The courses, the people, the way it had felt at once too small and too large, how I'd never quite found my footing socially. Why not, he asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I was pretending to be someone I understood how to be, I said. I think people can tell when you're doing that. He looked at me. Who were you pretending to be? Someone simpler, I said. Someone who didn't think too much. He absorbed that. You think too much, he said. About some things, I admitted. Not about work, about other things. What other things? I looked out at the darkening pasture. The first stars were starting. Myself mostly, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then softly, that's something we have in common. I looked at him. He was looking out at the same stretch of darkening sky, his expression composed but not closed, and I understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like something coming into focus after a long time of blur, that he was telling me something. Not directly, Cole didn't do anything directly, but he was telling me something. I just didn't know if I was brave enough to hear it. Claire came home for a weekend in mid-August. My sister is 4 years older than me, works in Austin as a landscape architect, and has the particular gift of seeing the people she loves clearly without being cruel about it. She arrived on Saturday afternoon with wine and a bag of tamales from a place she liked in Austin, and within approximately 20 minutes of being home, she had assessed every living creature on the property, including Cole. I saw her watching him at dinner. Not obviously, Claire doesn't do anything obviously, but I knew her, and I tracked the slight tilt of her head, the way she asked him casual questions and listened to the answers with more attention than the questions seemed to warrant. Later, doing dishes, she nudged my shoulder with hers and said very casually, "He's interesting." "He's a good hand," I said. "That's not what I said." She handed me a plate to dry. "I said he's interesting." I dried the plate with great concentration. "He reads a lot," I offered. Claire made a sound that was technically an acknowledgement but functionally an editorial. We finished the dishes in silence. Then she said, "Eli." "What?" "You know I don't ask about things that aren't my business," she said. "So I'm not asking. I'm just saying you look different this summer. You look more," she searched for the word, "awake." I stared at the dish rack. My heart was doing something uncomfortable. "I'm just home," I said. "I like being home." She said. That was all she said. But the way she said, she was my sister and I'd known her my whole life, and the way she said held about 1,000 words she was choosing not to say, and all of them were gentle. I didn't sleep well that night. The night Claire left Sunday, I went out to the east fence for my evening walk and Cole was already there. He was leaning on the fence post looking west, where the last of the sunset was going gold and purple over the ridge, a cigarette between his fingers. He heard me coming and turned, and the sunset was behind him, and the light was extraordinary, and I stopped walking for a moment because I was simply, without strategy or warning, overwhelmed. Not by anything he'd done, not by anything I'd done, just by him being there in that light, looking at me the way he did, that steadiest of looks, the one that said, "I see you and I'm not going anywhere," and by the accumulated weight of 2 months of everything between us pressing against the inside of my chest. "Sunset's good tonight," he said. "Yeah," I said. My voice came out normal. I wasn't sure how. I walked up to the fence and stood beside him, close enough that our arms almost touched. We watched the sun finish going down. The sky turned rose and then lavender and then deep blue. Stars came out. The cigarette burned down and he put it out. "Your sister's good people," he said. "She is," I said. "Did she grill you?" "Little bit," he said. "She asked me about my family, my plans, what I thought of the ranch." "What did you say about the ranch?" He was quiet for a moment. "That it's the best place I've worked," he said. "That the people here are," another pause, longer this time, "different from what I'm used to." "Different how?" He turned his head to look at me, and we were standing close enough that the movement brought his face near mine, nearer than usual, and I could see the detail of his expression clearly. The way his jaw was set, the way his eyes held that complexity that I'd come to recognize as him working out whether to say something. "Real," he said quietly, "different because they're real." We looked at each other for a moment that stretched like pulled thread, thin and taut and trembling. And then I said something completely neutral about the weather and he responded in kind, and we walked back to the house in the dark, shoulder to shoulder on the narrow path, close enough that our hands nearly brushed twice. Neither of us moved away. I need to stop and be honest with you for a moment, the way you can only be honest in the middle of a story, when the beginning is behind you and the ending isn't visible yet. By the end of August, I don't know what word to use. Gone seems too dramatic, but it's the most accurate. I was gone on Cole Hargrove the way you're gone on something you can't stop thinking about even when you're trying, the way music gets in your head and plays behind everything else. It wasn't just attraction, though it was that too. It was something larger and more frightening, the kind of feeling that takes you over not like a flood but like a tide. So gradually, you don't realize how deep you are until you try to walk and you're already in over your head. And I was terrified. Not of him, not specifically, but of what it meant, what it required, what it would change. I was 22 and had spent years maintaining a careful silence about this particular part of myself, and there's a strange, awful comfort in silence, in the absence of a problem, even when the absence is itself a kind of pain. The idea of stepping out of that silence felt like stepping off a ledge, and I didn't know what was at the bottom. And then there was the question of Cole himself. What he was, what he felt, what he wanted. I had fragments, hints, the careful architecture of things he didn't say, but I didn't have certainty. And certainty felt necessary before I could let myself want anything openly. If I was wrong, I would ruin something I'd come to value more than I'd expected. If I was right. Well, I wasn't ready to think about being right. So I kept the feeling inside, which is what I've always done with the things that matter most to me. And I kept showing up at the fence at sunset and kept handing him flashlights and kept listening to him talk about West Texas and Towns Van Zandt and what makes a knot reliable. And I kept not saying the thing I most needed to say. September brought a new complication in the form of a man named Derek Holloway. Derek was 31, blonde, good-looking in the way of someone who knows he's good-looking, and has organized much of his personality around this fact. He was a horse trader from Bourne, who came to look at two of my father's quarter horses with an eye toward purchase, and he arrived on a Thursday morning in a new truck pulling a clean trailer, and he shook everyone's hand with that particular grip of a man auditioning to be liked. He stayed 2 days while my father and he negotiated. In those 2 days, he ate at our table, slept in the guest room, and spent a considerable amount of time in the paddock with Cole, who was showing him the horses. I watched this from a distance that I told myself was casual. Derek had that easy, expansive social style that I'd never quite managed, the kind that fills a room without effort, and he directed it at everyone equally and extravagantly. He told my mother her cooking was incredible, and my father that his operation was the finest he'd seen in the region, and me that I was clearly going to be a hell of a rancher. He meant none of it in a bad way. I don't think he was malicious, just fluent in the language of charm. And with Cole, he was different, attentive, specific. I noticed this. Cole was showing Derek one of the mares, running through her training and disposition, and Derek was watching him with an interest that went beyond the horse. He asked Cole questions about himself, background, experience, plans, that he hadn't asked anyone else, and Cole answered with his usual reserve, but I could see, even from across the paddock, that Derek's directness was landing somewhere. Cole wasn't dismissing it the way he dismissed most social overtures. At dinner that night, Derek sat across from Cole and talked to him through most of the meal, animated and engaged, and Cole responded more fully than I was used to seeing him respond to someone he'd just met. He even smiled, actually smiled, not the corner of the mouth almost smile I'd learned to read, but a full, real smile, at something Derek said that I didn't catch. I stared at my plate and felt something cold move through my chest. Marcus, sitting next to me, said quietly, "Good stew tonight." "Yeah," I said. I excused myself from the table early, claiming I needed to check the south pasture gate, which was a transparent lie that nobody called me on. I walked to the east fence in the dark, not the sunset this time but full dark, the stars high and indifferent overhead, and I stood there with my hands in my pockets and did some very unwelcome thinking. The feeling in my chest, the cold, contracting thing that had started in the paddock and crystallized at dinner, I knew what it was. It was jealousy. And the fact that I felt it that clearly, that immediately, that specifically, told me things about my own situation that I'd been successfully avoiding knowing for weeks. I was jealous of Derek Holloway because he was talking to Cole with an ease and directness I was too afraid to use, and because Cole had smiled at him in a way that I desperately, absurdly wanted to be the reason for. I stayed at the fence for a long time. The stars came in and out behind thin clouds. A coyote called from somewhere past the ridge, distant and mournful. The ranch was quiet. By the time I walked back to the house, I'd reached a decision of sorts. Not an action, I wasn't ready for action, but a kind of internal acknowledgement. A willingness to admit to myself, finally, privately, in the dark, what this summer had been making plain. I had feelings for Cole Hargrove. Real feelings, the large and inconvenient and terrifying kind. And whatever happened from here, I couldn't keep pretending I didn't. Derek Holloway bought the horses the next morning and left after lunch, shaking hands all around and saying to Cole, with the easy confidence of a man who gets what he goes after, "You ever need a change of scenery, you'd fit in well with my operation. Serious offer." Cole had nodded and said, "Appreciate that." Nothing more. But I'd watched it, and I'd watched Derek drive out, and I'd watched Cole watch the truck go, and I couldn't read his expression, and not knowing was its own particular torture. That evening, Cole didn't come to the east fence. It was the first time in several weeks that he hadn't, one way or another, ended up there when I did. I told myself it meant nothing. I walked to the fence alone and stood there for 20 minutes and told myself repeatedly that it meant nothing. Then I went back inside and lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt 17 different kinds of uncertain. Something changed after Derek Holloway left. Or maybe it didn't change. Maybe I just noticed for the first time the limits of what Cole and I had, because limits are invisible until something brings them into focus. He was still Cole, still competent and quiet and exactly who he'd always been. He still talked to me about books and work and the horses, still made that almost smile when I said something he found funny, still fell into step beside me on the path to the east fence in the evenings. But there was a guardedness in him that I hadn't noticed before, or maybe that I'd stopped noticing over the summer, and now noticed again, sharp as ever. He was careful with me. He kept just enough distance. He gave just enough to be warm without being open. And I began to wonder, in the way that fear makes you wonder things, whether I had imagined the connection I thought we had, whether I'd been projecting my own feelings onto a man who was simply being decently kind to his employer's son. I became quieter around him. I couldn't help it. When you're trying not to want something, the effort shows, even when you don't mean it to. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything with those dark, steady eyes. One morning, working on the water pump near the main barn, he said, without preamble, "You all right?" "Fine," I said. "Why?" "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm usually quiet," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "Different quiet," he said. I didn't answer that. I worked on the pump fitting. He worked on the pump fitting. The silence wasn't comfortable the way it usually was. It had edges. "I'm fine," I said again stupidly. He held my gaze for a second, and something moved in his expression. Something between concern and a kind of careful backing away, as if he'd reached for something and then thought better of it. "Okay," he said, and went back to work. I hated myself a little for the next hour. The thing about sustained, unexpressed feeling is that it finds other outlets. In my case, it found the outlet of overworking. Through most of September, I worked at a pace that even my father commented on, moving through tasks with a focused energy that was really just a leash on everything I wasn't letting myself think about. I started getting up as early as Cole, sometimes earlier, and being out in the yard before anyone else. I took on extra projects, repairing the old storage barn at the back of the property, reseeding the north pasture, rebuilding the deck on the east side of the main house that had been structurally questionable for years. My father watched all of this with what I interpreted as quiet satisfaction, which made me feel slightly guilty, because my industriousness wasn't virtue, it was avoidance in disguise. Cole and I still worked together, still talked in the evenings, still occupied the same close orbit. But something was different, and we both knew it, and neither of us acknowledged it, and the unacknowledged thing grew larger and more awkward with every passing day. One night, a clear, cool night, the kind that arrives in Texas in late September as a mercy after the summer, we were sitting on the porch after dinner, not talking, and the silence had gone wrong. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill space. It was the silence of two people who have something to say and aren't saying it. Cole spoke first. He said, "Did I do something?" I looked at him. He was looking at me directly, his expression open in the careful way that meant he was working against his own instincts. "No," I said, "you didn't do anything." "Then what is it?" he said. I looked at the dark yard, the shapes of the barn and the fence, the stars beginning overhead. My heart was doing something dramatic and unpleasant. I had 3 seconds to decide whether to say something honest or retreat further into "I'm fine." "I'm working some things out," I said. "It's not about you, I stopped. I tried again. It's not something you did wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," I said. And then, before I could stop myself, "Are you thinking about Derek Holloway's offer?" The question came out before I decided to ask it. I heard it in the air after I said it and almost winced. Cole looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of surprised attention, the way you look at something unexpected. "Why do you ask?" he said. I stopped. "I'd hate for you to leave," I said, "that's all." He was very still for a moment. The night was quiet around us, crickets, a distant frog at the creek, the soft sound of horses breathing in the barn. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. His voice was low and even, but there was something underneath it, some quality of intention, like a sentence that could mean multiple things and means all of them at once. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. I looked back out at the dark yard and breathed. After a moment, Cole said, "Eli." I turned. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something more unguarded than usual, something that looked almost like effort, like it was costing him to hold my gaze that directly. He started to say something. His jaw moved. He stopped. "Never mind," he said. I wanted to say no, say it. I wanted to say, "I'm listening, I'll always listen, tell me." But something in me was still too afraid of being wrong, of changing something irretrievably, and I let the moment pass. "Good night, Cole," I said quietly. "Night," he said. I went inside. I stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, hands flat on the counter, and let myself feel the full weight of my own cowardice. Then I went to bed. October. My father's knee was improving, but slowly, and the doctor wanted him to limit his heavy physical work for another month. This meant Cole effectively ran the daily ranch operations almost entirely, coordinating everything with Marcus and Billy while my father oversaw from a distance. It was a significant responsibility, and Cole carried it without visible strain. But I could see, those first weeks of October, that something was happening with him that he wasn't sharing. He was more withdrawn than usual in the evenings. He disappeared sometimes into the bunkhouse after dinner and didn't come out. The letters he wrote at night became more frequent. He was sleeping less. I could see the light on in the bunkhouse at late hours when I got up for water, and the slight deepening of shadow under his eyes in the mornings. I wanted to ask. The version of me from August, who'd been moving through this summer with an almost naive openness, would have asked. But the version of me from September, who'd built distance and called it safety, hesitated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A Friday afternoon, first week of October. I was repairing a section of corral fencing, and I'd been at it since morning, and the day had been long and physical, and I was tired in the good, honest way of hard work. Cole came by to check on the south pasture water and stopped when he saw me struggling with a post that had shifted in the wet ground. "Let me get the other end," he said. He dropped what he was carrying and grabbed the post, and we worked it together, both straining against the resistance of the damp earth, until it settled into place with the abrupt satisfaction of something done. We stood back to look at it, breathing hard. And Cole laughed. Not at anything. Just the physical release of it, the effort and the accomplishment, and it came out of him real and spontaneous and low, and he looked over at me with that released, unguarded expression I'd seen in flashes and fragments all summer. And I was so happy to see it, so genuinely and helplessly happy just to see him laugh, that I laughed too. We stood there in the afternoon light, slightly ridiculous and out of breath, laughing at a fence post. And when it died down and we were just standing there, still slightly breathless, he looked at me with something I can only describe as real, the realest look he'd ever given me, no guard up, no distance calculated, and he said, very quietly, "I'm going to miss this place." The words landed on me like cold water. "Are you leaving?" I said. My voice came out completely level. I have no idea how. He looked away, his jaw tightened. "My dad," he said. "He's getting worse. The call last month, he stopped. They can't find anyone to manage his care. He's alone out there in Odessa." I absorbed this. "You're going back," I said. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what I'm doing." He ran a hand along his jaw. "I've been trying to figure it out for weeks." "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at me. What would I have said? And there was something in the question, a kind of exhausted, earnest vulnerability that broke open something in my chest. "You would have said, Cole's dealing with something heavy, and I would have listened," I said. "That's what I would have said." He was quiet for a moment. He nodded slowly, and he looked almost wounded by the simplicity of it. The way people look when kindness finds a place they forgot was tender. "I'm not good at that," he said. "The asking for things." "I know," I said. "Neither am I." We stood there with the fence post between us, literally and otherwise. "You don't have to leave," I said. "I mean, if your dad needs help, there are options. And my family," I stopped, because I was moving fast and I needed to be careful about what I was offering and why. "We could figure something out, if you wanted to figure something out." He looked at me for a long moment. And in that look, that long, searching, careful look, I saw something I'd been looking for all summer without letting myself know I was looking. A door that was open, just barely, just enough to see light through the crack. Neither of us said anything more. We went back to work. But something had shifted back. The distance of September had cracked open. Whatever the next thing was, we were heading toward it. That evening, Cole knocked on the back door of the house after dinner. My mother answered it and called me, and I came to the door and he was standing on the porch, hat in his hands in the way he had when he wanted to say something that mattered, and he said, "You want to take a walk?" We walked to the east fence. The moon was nearly full and the night was cool and clear, and the sky was enormous, the way it gets in October in the hill country when the humidity has finally broken, and the air is clean all the way down. We walked in silence for a while, and then Cole said, "I need to tell you something." "Okay," I said. He was quiet for a moment. We'd reached the fence and stopped, leaning on the top rail looking out at the moonlit pasture. He took a slow breath. "I'm not," he stopped, started again. "I don't," another stop. He pressed his hand flat on the fence rail and stared out at the dark pasture, and I watched the side of his face in the moonlight, the set of his jaw, the slight movement of his throat, and I understood that whatever he was trying to say was something he'd never said out loud before, maybe not even to himself. I didn't rush him. I stood beside him and waited. Finally, quietly, "This is the first place in a long time that I haven't wanted to leave," he said. I looked at him. He kept looking out at the pasture. "I've been trying to talk myself into leaving, telling myself it's practical. My dad, other work, whatever. But that's not," he stopped. "That's not the real reason I've been thinking about it." "What's the real reason?" I said. My voice was very quiet. He turned his head and looked at me. We were close. The fence was narrow and we were standing side by side, and his face was 2 feet from mine in the moonlight. And the look he gave me was completely unguarded, all the careful opacity gone, just his face and his eyes and whatever was in them. "I got scared," he said, simply, plainly. "I got scared, and I'm not used to that, and my first instinct is always to move before something can take hold." My heart was very loud. "But you didn't leave," I said. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Because of the ranch," I said. He held my gaze. "Partly," he said. The moonlight, the night air, the fence rail under my hands, the particular held breath quality of a moment where everything is suspended just before it tips. "Cole," I said. "Eli," he said at the same time. We both stopped. And then, because something in both of us had run out of patience with silence, because we'd been circling this for 4 months, because the distance of September had worn away the last of my courage as caution, and left me with something that felt more like courage as necessity, I said, "I need to tell you something too." I told him. Not all of it, not in a rush. That's not how I work, and it's not how he receives things. I told it slowly, the way you tell something true when you're still figuring out the shape of it as you speak. I told him that I'd spent all summer feeling something I didn't know what to do with, that I was still working out certain things about myself that I'd kept quiet for a long time, that I didn't have a clean, organized statement to offer him, just the honest fact of what had been happening inside me since that night in June when I'd found him crying by the barn. I told him that I was afraid of being wrong about what I thought I'd been seeing in him, and more afraid of being right and doing nothing about it. My voice stayed steady. I'm proud of that even now. It didn't stay steady because I wasn't scared, I was terrified, my heart going at a pace that seemed physically unsustainable. It stayed steady because I decided that the honesty mattered more than the fear, and once I decided that, somehow the fear had to step back. When I finished, the night was quiet around us. Cole stood beside me, his forearms on the fence rail, looking out at the pasture. He didn't look at me while I was talking, and he didn't look at me now, and the silence after I finished stretched and I began, carefully, to prepare for the possibility that I had been wrong, that I'd misread everything, that I was about to face something humiliating and painful and final. Then he said very quietly, "I know." I looked at him. He turned his head then, and his eyes met mine. And in them was something I can only describe as the expression of a man who has been holding something back for a long time and has finally, with great effort and relief, stopped. "I know," he said again, "because me too." The words were simple. They were the simplest words in the world. But I'd been waiting for them, in the particular way that you wait for something you've wanted so badly you've stopped fully believing it's possible. And they arrived, and I stood there and felt them settle in my chest like something coming home. "For how long?" I said. He almost laughed, breathed out through his nose in that way of his, like laughter held just barely inside. "Since the second week," he said, "when you told me you'd already known the fence knot." I stared at him, "The fence knot." "The way you looked when I said that," he said. He shook his head slightly. "You were so embarrassed, and then you said that thing about wanting to see if my version was different, and you were a terrible liar, and I thought—" He paused. His voice had gone quieter. "I thought, oh, this is going to be a problem." Something warm was spreading through my chest, slow and overwhelming. "A problem," I said. "For me," he clarified. "A problem for me, because I've been running from problems like this for 3 years, and I came to this ranch to work, not to—" He stopped, looked at me. Something in his expression was struggling with itself, still guarded, still careful, but the guard had a gap in it now that nothing was going to close. "Not to feel the way I've been feeling." "What way?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The moonlight was full on his face. I could see everything, the tension in his jaw, the particular steady light in his eyes, the way his breath had slowed and deepened. "Like I want to stay," he said. I couldn't speak for a moment. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had too much and none of it was sufficient. "Then stay," I said. It came out rougher than I'd planned, more direct than I usually manage. But it was the truest thing I'd said all summer. He looked at me. And then slowly, deliberately, with that same unhurried precision he applied to everything, he reached over and covered my hand on the fence rail with his. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand over mine, warm and steady, and we both stood there, hearts loud in the quiet night, looking out at the moonlit ranch. "I don't know how to do this," he said after a while. "This, whatever this is." "Neither do I said. "We'd have to be careful," he said. "With your family, with everything." I know, I said, we would. And I'm not, he stopped, tried again. I have a lot of things to work out about myself, about my dad, about where I am and what I want. So do I said. This is complicated, he said. It is, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't care, he said. I mean, I do, but I don't, not enough to keep pretending. I turned my head and looked at him. He was already looking at me. I don't care either, I said. The silence that followed was the best silence I've ever sat in, full and warm and full of possibility rather than things unsaid. The night was enormous around us, stars and moonlight and the breathing land, and his hand was on mine on the fence rail, and I thought, here, this is it. This is the thing I was so afraid of, and it turns out it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like landing. We walked back to the house slowly, taking the long way, not talking much, not needing to. The warmth between us had changed in quality. It had been warm all summer, but it had been the warmth of something held at arm's length, carefully managed. This was different. This was warmth without the management, without the careful distance, and it was quiet and enormous, and I kept stealing glances at his profile in the moonlight and thinking things I didn't know how to say. At the gate between the east pasture and the yard, he stopped. He turned and looked at me, and his expression was complex and honest and slightly wary. Not of me, I understood now, but of himself, of the unfamiliar territory of this. I need some time to figure out what to do about my dad, he said. That's real. I can't just leave it. Of course not, I said. But I'm not, he took a breath. I want to be clear that I'm not using that as an excuse to run. I know, I said. Do you? He said. And there was something genuine in the question, a need for reassurance that surprised me, coming from him, and that made me understand that his guardedness had never been indifference but its opposite. He needed me to know, to really know, that this was real. Yes, I said, I know. He nodded. He reached out and briefly, gently, touched my arm, just his fingers on my forearm for a second, and then his hand dropped. Such a small thing. It might not even have counted as a gesture in any other context. But in the context of us, in the context of 4 months of carefully maintained proximity and all the things we hadn't said, it was everything. Night, Eli, he said. Night, I said. He went to the bunkhouse. I went to the house. I stood in my bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror above the dresser, and I looked the same as always, same face, same brown eyes, same ordinary features, and yet I felt entirely different, like something had been turned on inside me that had been off for a very long time. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. October moved forward. Nothing changed dramatically in the visible structure of our days. We were still employer's son and ranch hand, still worked the same land in the same way, still sat at the same table for meals and talked about the same things. We were careful, as we'd agreed to be. My family didn't know, though Claire, when she called that weekend, somehow managed to communicate, through the medium of tone and pointed silence, that she noticed something had shifted in me without asking a single direct question. You sound better, she said. I'm fine, I said. I know you're fine, she said. I said you sound better. I didn't answer that. She didn't push. That was the particular elegance of Claire. What changed was everything under the surface. The quality of our evenings. The way a glance could carry a whole conversation. The ease that had been growing all summer but had been tangled up in uncertainty. That ease was now clean and uncomplicated, and we moved through our days with it like an invisible thread between us, always there, needing no maintenance. We talked differently now. Not just about books and work, but about the things underneath. He told me about growing up in Odessa with a father who showed love through proximity and silence rather than words, who had never learned to say the things that needed to be said, and had passed that silence on like an inheritance. He told me about leaving at 18, about the 3 years of wandering ranch to ranch, about the 2 close friendships he'd left behind because he'd run before they could become more than friendships, and the particular loneliness of that pattern. I told him about college, about Jesse, about the hollow feeling on the drive home from prom. about spending 2 years surrounded by people and feeling essentially alone, because I was carrying something I couldn't put down but also couldn't look at directly. About coming home and feeling, in the particular smell of the cedar and the dust, the relief of something familiar, and then the terror of discovering that home could be the place where you finally ran out of room to run from yourself. He listened to all of it with the full, still attention that was one of his particular gifts. He didn't offer easy comfort or premature resolution. He just listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You've been carrying that alone a long time." "Yeah," I said. "You don't have to anymore," he said. Simple, plain, the way he said everything. And yet it reached down into somewhere I've been keeping very quiet and very protected for a very long time and did something I can't fully articulate, loosened something, made space, let light in. The phone call about his father came on a Tuesday in mid-October. I knew it was bad before he said anything, just from the way he walked away from the call, head down, one hand in his back pocket, the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was absorbing something heavy. I watched from the porch and waited. He came to me after about 10 minutes, just walked up to where I was sitting on the porch steps and stood in front of me, and I looked up at him and could see it in his face. The weight of a decision he hadn't made yet, but already knew he had to. "He fell," Cole said. "They think he fractured his hip. He's in the hospital. There's no one there." "You need to go," I said. He looked at me. "Yeah," he said. "When?" "Tomorrow, probably," he said, "or the day after." He ran a hand across the back of his neck. "I'll talk to your father today." I stood up. We were close, standing the way we stood sometimes, face to face, the particular proximity that had developed between us that felt natural now, necessary even. I looked at him and said, "Is this you running?" He looked at me, his jaw tightened. "No," he said, with a certainty that had no waver in it. "Good," I said, "because it's different if you're going to come back." "I'm going to come back," he said. His eyes on mine were steady and clear. "That's not something I'm uncertain about." We stood there for a moment, and I wanted to say 10 things and none of them were possible right now. Not here in the open yard in the middle of the day. And so I reached out and briefly, gripped his forearm just once, just firm, and then let go. He nodded. He went to talk to my father. He told my father he needed 2 weeks, maybe 3, a family emergency. My father, who was a perceptive man under the exterior of plainness, looked at him and said, "Take the time you need, Cole. Your job's here when you come back." Cole thanked him and went to pack. I didn't go to the bunkhouse. I didn't want the image of him packing, the truck with the electrical tape mirror, the duffel bag going into the bed, to be what I held onto. Instead, I went to the barn and worked with the horses for the rest of the afternoon, the long, meditative work of brushing and talking and being present with them. He found me there at dusk. He stood in the barn door, travel bag over his shoulder, hat on, and he looked at me with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "I'm heading out early tomorrow," he said. "Okay," I said. "Eli," he stopped. "Go," I said. "Your dad needs you. We'll be here." He was quiet for a moment. "You'll be here," he said, and it was a statement and a question and a small, careful trust all at once. "I'll be here," I said. He looked at me, and then he walked over directly, unhesitant, purposeful in the way he was when he decided to do something. And he stood in front of me close, and he put his hand on my face, his palm against my jaw, warm and steady. And he looked at me for a long moment with all of that dark, honest, complex openness that had been building all summer. "I'll be back," he said. I put my hand briefly over his, just for a second, warm and sure. "I know," I said. He nodded. He lowered his hand. He turned and walked out of the barn, and I listened to his footsteps on the barn floor and then the yard, and then the sound of the bunkhouse door. I stood in the barn with the horses for a long time in the smell of hay and dust and cedar, and I let myself feel the full weight of what this was, what it had become, what it might be, what it was going to require. All of it. The uncertainty, the complexity, the things still unresolved in both of us. The fact that this was real, and real things were the hardest and most necessary things, and I'd been running from real for a long time. Rambler, my father's standoffish quarter horse, who almost never initiated contact, pushed his nose against my shoulder. "I know," I said to him, "me too." He was gone for 17 days. He texted some. Cole was not a natural texter. His messages were short, functional, occasionally blunt, which was somehow exactly right. Updates on his father, the surgery, the recovery, the particular grim logistics of arranging home care for a man who didn't want it and lived in a city where Cole had burned most of his bridges by leaving at 18. I texted back briefly. I didn't want to crowd him. He had enough to manage. But on the third night, late, I got a text that said, "It's weird to not have anything good to look at the end of the day. The sky here is garbage compared to yours." I stared at it for a long moment. I typed back, "It's still here. Stars aren't going anywhere." "Are you?" he sent. "No," I sent. "Okay," he sent. And then after a minute, "Good." The 17 days were their own kind of education. Without him there, I had a great deal of space in my head that had previously been occupied with him, and I used that space to do some long-deferred thinking about myself. The kind of thinking I'd been avoiding for years, the kind that required silence and honesty and a willingness to sit with discomfort until it became clarity. I'm not going to tell you I had some dramatic revelation. The truth is more ordinary than that. I sat with what I knew about myself, what I'd known really for a long time, and I stopped arguing with it. That's all. I stopped pretending I could argue it into something more convenient, and I just looked at it plainly and said, "This is true. This is part of who I am. Now what?" The now what was complicated and long-term, and I didn't have all the answers. What I had was a beginning, an honesty with myself that I'd never fully achieved before. And that was enough for now. You don't have to have the whole map. You just have to take the next step. I thought about my family, about my father, solid and reserved, who had never in my memory said anything dismissive or cruel about anyone, but who had also never said anything that created space for this. About my mother, whose warmth was genuine and consistent and whose love, I was almost certain, was larger than any condition. About Claire, who'd been watching me all summer with those careful, perceptive eyes. I thought about what it would mean to be honest with them, not today, not while I was still finding the shape of it myself, but eventually. Eventually. I thought about Cole, about who he was, about the parallel silences he'd maintained about himself for years, about the particular bravery required to say "me too" on a moonlit fence rail when everything in your history has told you to move before anyone can see you clearly. I thought about what it might look like to build something real, something that took time and care and patience, with a man who was still figuring out his own story and whose story was worth waiting for. I thought all of this and more in the 17 days he was gone, and I worked the ranch in the crisp October air and talked to my family and fed the horses and watched the stars and waited. He came back on a Thursday afternoon, 17 days after he'd left. I knew he was coming. He'd texted the night before, heading back tomorrow. Afternoon, probably. I'd spent the morning trying to be normal about this and failing. Marcus gave me a look at lunch that said he'd noticed something was off but wasn't going to say anything. My mother made a particular effort with dinner. I was at the east fence when his truck came down the main road. I'd gone there deliberately. I didn't want to be standing in the yard waiting, which felt desperate, but I also couldn't pretend to be somewhere that made no sense. The east fence was where we'd always been. It made sense. I heard the truck and stood up straighter, and then I made myself be still, and I listened to the sound of the engine and the crunch of gravel, and then the engine cutting off, and I waited. About 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the path behind me. I didn't turn around. I looked out at the pasture, at the late afternoon light on the dry grass, at the ridge in the distance. I heard him come up alongside me and felt him stop beside me, close, his arm almost touching mine. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. We stood there for a moment looking out at the ranch. The light was extraordinary late October, the low golden angle of it, everything saturated and warm. The cattle were moving slowly in the south pasture. A hawk circled overhead. "How's your dad?" I said. "Better," he said. "He's got a home care arrangement now, doesn't like it, but a pause. He'll be okay." "And you?" I said. He was quiet for a beat. "Better," he said again. "Now." His voice was quiet, and the now landed with a specificity that he'd intended. I turned my head and looked at him. He was already looking at me, and the look was the full, unhidden version, no careful opacity, no measured distance. Just him, looking at me with everything I'd learned to read all summer, plus something new. The particular quality of a person who's been away from something they wanted and is now back. 17 days is a long time, I said. Too long, he said. I looked at him for a moment. And then, because there was no reason left not to, I turned fully toward him and he turned toward me, and he reached up and put his hand on the side of my face again. The way he had in the barn, his palm warm against my jaw, and this time I leaned into it. Just slightly, just enough to say yes, this, exactly this. "Eli," he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "I meant what I said," he said. "Before I left, I'm not running, I'm done running." "I know," I said. "Do you trust that?" he said. I looked at him, at the face I'd been learning all summer, at the dark, steady eyes that had seen me more clearly, these past months, than anyone had in years. "Yes," I said, "I trust it." His thumb moved very slightly against my jaw, and then he leaned his forehead against mine, gently, carefully, not rushed, not dramatic, just present, and we stood there like that on the east fence in the October light, foreheads together, breathing the same air, neither of us moving, neither of us needing to. The ranch was quiet around us. The hawk circled and drifted south. The light went golden and then gold red, the ridge on fire with the last of the afternoon. And we just stood there, together, real. The next weeks were the most complex and the most quietly beautiful of my life. Complex because nothing was resolved, not fully. There were still things to navigate, still conversations I needed to have with my family, still parts of ourselves we were both learning to understand. Cole was working through whatever his years of movement had built in him, the reflexive self-sufficiency, the pattern of leaving, the sense that wanting something permanent was asking for something that would be taken away. I was working through my own long silence, the layers of unexplored territory inside myself that needed time and honesty to map properly. Beautiful because we were doing it together, and together turned out to be different than I'd imagined. Not a solution to the complexity, but a way of carrying it, a second set of hands, a presence that made the hard things lighter just by being present. We settled into something that was partly still the friendship of the summer and partly new, a closeness that had been named and claimed, that we moved around carefully and protectively, keeping it between ourselves while we figured out the larger shape of things. We were still cautious, still private, but the caution now felt like something chosen rather than something forced, and that made all the difference. One evening in early November, we were sitting on the porch after a long day, my mother inside making tea, my father gone to bed early. The night was cold for the first time that fall, genuinely cold, a cold front having moved down from the plains overnight, and the stars were extraordinary in the new sharp air. "I told my dad," Cole said, quietly, casually in the way he sometimes dropped things that weren't casual at all. I looked at him. "About," I said. "About me," he said, "about who I am." He was looking at the stars. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Is there someone?" Cole paused. I said yes. "What did he say?" I asked. Cole was quiet for a moment, his jaw moved. He said, "Good, a person shouldn't be alone." Another pause. His voice, when he continued, was lower than usual. It wasn't a lot, but from him, it was something. I reached over and covered his hand with mine. He turned his hand over, his fingers closing around mine, and we sat like that in the cold night, hands warm between us, watching the stars. After a while I said, "I'm going to tell Claire." He looked at me. Soon, I said. I think she already knows or suspects, but I want to say it out loud to someone. I paused. I want to practice, I think, before, eventually, I tell everyone. He squeezed my hand. You don't have to rush it, he said. I know, I said, but I want to. I want to stop being quiet about things that matter. He looked at me with that expression, the full, honest, unhidden one, and nodded. Me too, he said. I called Claire that weekend. It wasn't the long, prepared conversation I'd imagined having for years in the abstract. It was mostly just me saying, I need to tell you something, and then telling her, and her listening without interrupting, and then the silence afterward. And then her voice, warm and steady and completely without surprise. I know Eli, I've known for a while. I laughed a little shakily. Am I that obvious? Only to people paying attention, she said, which is me, a pause, and Cole, right. I didn't answer immediately. She made that sound that held 1,000 words. I'm glad, she said finally, simply. I'm really, really glad. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone against my ear and felt something I can only describe as the relief of being fully seen, understood, and not diminished by it. Not completed by it. Just witnessed. Don't make it weird with Mom and Dad, I said. Oh, I'm going to make it extremely weird, she said. And then she laughed and I laughed, and it was the best phone call I'd ever had. Winter came to the hill country the way it always does, gradually. Then suddenly, the days going gold and then gray, the cedar bright against the pale sky, the mornings cold enough to see your breath. Cole stayed. He was still the ranch hand, still working alongside Marcus and Billy, still running operations in the quiet way that had become essential to how the ranch functioned. But he was also something else now, something that didn't have an easy label in the vocabulary of a Texas hill country ranch, and that I was still learning to hold without labeling. He was my person. That's the simplest way I can put it. He was the person I thought about first when something happened, good or bad or confusing or just interesting. He was the person I looked for at the end of a long day, whose presence made things settle. He was the person I could be entirely honest with, without management or performance, and whose honesty I received the same way. That doesn't happen easily or often. I know that now. It's something that takes time and two people willing to be real with each other, willing to be scared and stay anyway, willing to say me too on a moonlit fence rail and mean it. My parents didn't know yet, not formally. But my mother, who was sharp and warm and had loved Cole with the particular maternal warmth she gave to people who needed steadiness in their lives, had started doing something that I noticed. She set 2 mugs of coffee on the porch in the morning sometimes, not 3 or 4, just 2. She arranged seating at dinner in ways that were subtle and deniable. She left us alone in ways that felt intentional. One morning, catching me in the kitchen alone, she put her hand on my face briefly, in the exact gesture Cole used on me, which I'm sure was coincidence but which felt in that moment like something cosmic, and she said, "You seem happy, Eli." "I am," I said. She nodded. Her eyes were warm. She went back to making breakfast without another word. It wasn't the formal conversation. That was still coming in its own time when I was ready, which I was getting closer to every day. But it was something. It was enough for now. On a Saturday afternoon in December, with the first real freeze of the season turning the grass silver and the creek down to a thread, and the sky that particular high, pale blue of winter in Texas, Cole and I went riding. We went east, past the fence line, out into the cedar-covered hills, the horses moving steadily in the cold air. There was no particular destination. That was the point. We rode through the cedar and the scrub oak and the limestone outcroppings, the horses breathing white into the cold air, the land quiet and immense around us. On a ridge that overlooked the valley, we stopped. The horses stood, blowing, and we sat in the saddle and looked out at the spread of the hill country below us. The cedar and the dry grass and the winter sky, the thin silver line of the creek, the distant shape of the ranch buildings, smoke from the chimney of the main house rising straight up into the still air. "It really is something," Cole said. "Yeah," I said. We sat there for a while, looking at the land. "Cole," I said. He looked over. "I'm glad you didn't leave," I said. "That night in September when Derek offered you the job." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost did," he said. "What stopped you?" He looked at me. His hat was pushed back and his eyes were clear in the winter light, and his expression was that full, honest version. The one I'd come to love most, the one that cost him something and gave me everything. "You said you'd hate for me to leave," he said. "You said it like you meant it." I had meant it more than he'd known, more than I'd let on. "I meant it," I said. "I know," he said. "That's what stopped me." We sat there on the ridge in the winter light, two men on two horses, looking out at the same land from the same height, breathing the same cold air, and I thought about everything that had happened between June and December. All the silences and almost moments encircling fears, and the slow, stubborn, necessary arrival at something true. I thought, I am 22 years old and I am at the beginning of things, and the beginning is terrifying and real, and exactly what I asked for. "Come on," I said, and turned my horse down the ridge, and he turned his and came with me, and we rode back toward the ranch through the winter cedar, side by side, and the sky was enormous above us, and the land was quiet all around, and there was nowhere else in the world I wanted to be. Epilogue. What stays? It is March now. The hill country is waking up. The mountain laurel is blooming in purple cascades along every fence line, and the first wildflowers are coming in, and the days are warming back toward that warm, golden version of themselves that began this whole story. Cole is still here. He is still the ranch hand in the way that things are still technically what they were even when they've fundamentally changed. He has his bunk in the bunkhouse, his particular morning routines, his cigarettes at sunrise by the east fence. He still fixes things that should be unfixable. He still talks to the horses. He still writes letters. But he also comes to the back door in the evenings and knocks and says, "Walk." And I get my jacket and we go. He still reads in the lamplight, but sometimes he reads on the porch now, close enough that our arms brush, and nobody remarks on it because slowly, without announcement or drama, the people who loved me came to understand the shape of things and to love them. Claire came home for Christmas, and she brought wine and sat between us at the table and talked to him about architecture and ranching and books, and treated him with the same easy warmth she'd have given anyone she'd chosen as family. And Cole sat there and received it with a slightly stunned expression, like a man who'd been expecting a door to slam and had walked through it into sunlight. My mother told him one morning in February that she was glad he'd stayed. Just like that, over breakfast, matter-of-factly. She poured his coffee and said, "I'm glad you stayed, Cole," and went back to the stove, and Cole sat there with his coffee and his composed face and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." And his voice had the quality of someone trying very hard to be calm about something that was not, for them, a calm thing at all. My father, my quiet, steady, plain-spoken father, said nothing directly. He said it the way he said everything important, without saying it at all. He started including Cole in decisions the way he included me. He asked his opinion. He accepted it. And one afternoon in January, working together on the old storage barn I'd been rebuilding, he said to both of us, apropos of nothing, "Good to have good people on the land." That was it. That was my father's soliloquy. It was enough. There are still things to figure out. There will always be things to figure out. That's what a life is, I'm coming to understand. It's not a finished product, not a solved equation. It's an ongoing process of trying to be honest and staying present and choosing, every day, the real over the convenient. But here is what I know tonight. Sitting on the porch in the March dark with the mountain laurel blooming, and the stars coming out and Cole sitting beside me close enough that our shoulders touch, reading his book in the lamplight from the window, his face quiet and focused. I know that finding yourself is not a single moment of revelation. It's a series of ordinary moments. A fence post, a cigarette in the dark, a conversation about fence knots, a hand on a fence rail at midnight, each one building on the last, each one real in its own small, necessary way. I know that the thing you're most afraid to want is usually the thing most worth having. I know that thou mayest, the timshel, the choice, the possibility is not just a thing in a book. It's the thing that matters, the choice to stay, the choice to speak, the choice to be known by someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. Cole puts his book down and looks at me. Just looks at me, the way he's looked at me all year, steady and clear and real. What are you thinking about? He says. Everything, I say. He makes that sound, the half-laugh, genuine and low, and looks back at the sky. Me too, he says. The stars are out in force tonight. The mountain laurel sends its sweetness into the dark air. Somewhere in the barn, Rambler shifts and breathes. We sit there together, under the enormous Texas sky, and we are 22 and 23 years old and at the very beginning of something. And the beginning is terrifying and full of possibility and real and exactly right. And we stay.
Thank you for hearing until the very end of the story. If it stayed with you, if even one moment made you feel something, that's everything. That's exactly why stories exist. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. The fence rail, the barn, the first cigarette in the dark. And one last question before you go. Cole kept one secret thought this entire story. Something about those letters he was reading by lamplight and who they were really meant for. Thanks for watching and keep watching.